Hello and welcome. My name is Timur Ahmadiev, and I'm sitting here at the Innova offices with Jonathan Lewis. Hello, Jonathan.
Oh, good morning, Timur. Nice to be here.
Nice to see you too. Thank you for coming.
A pleasure.
We are going to to record an interview, and I'm going to ask you some questions related to Oracle and your work.
My history.
Yes.
Yes.
So I would like to start with the questions about user groups. There are a lot of user groups in the world, and the UK Oracle user group is one of the biggest, one of the famous. And how do you describe the main purpose of the user groups?
Right. Well, as you say, I mean, the UK user group is very large, very well known, and I have been involved with the user group for, I think, nearly 20 years in various capacities. I was a director for a little while and on the board and so forth, but I've contributed a great deal to the user group. I think, from my perspective, the most important thing about the user group idea is that individuals who use the software, who have to live with the software, who do their job every day with the software, get an opportunity to talk to other people. And often it's the conversation, when you actually see someone eye to eye, when you start talking about what you're doing and where your problems are, you can start a conversation where you can all learn perhaps how to do something better or find a way of actually solving a problem, because you've got time to present an idea, have someone argue about it, make a counter-suggestion, make a suggestion to improve things and so on. And so despite the fact that you've got all these things like the OTM database forums, you've got other forums, you've got the MOS, My Oracle Support as it is now. I nearly said Metalink, but My Oracle Support. You've got all these things, and you've got all these bloggers who can supply you with information you can read. You've got these places where you can post a question and get 5, 10, 20 different people giving you bits of answers. But of course, if you post a question, it's quite hard to have a dialogue with someone, and they can't really ask you, well, tell me a little bit more about this, and this, because it's quite hard to type enough information to give them the right idea. So there's still plenty of scope for actually meeting someone, because in the space of 5 minutes conversation, you can exchange 10 times as much information as you could by going online and typing something perhaps into a blog or typing a question into the TechNet. So it's the personal, physical, face-to-face communication which I think is a tremendous benefit for the user group. And there are others, of course, but that's the very first one, I think, that really, really matters. Okay?
Great. Do you enjoy working and participating in the UK Oracle user group? And how do you, what is your, how to say, view on your work in this user group?
The view on the way I work with the user group, I've always enjoyed the time I spend with the user group. Mostly what I've done with the user group is just show up for, well, obviously the conference, the main conferences, but the UK user group particularly has, perhaps as many as 100 little events through the course of the year, and a huge number of events. And it's all broken down by special interests. So there's a group which is basically the database server group, and they'll have 3 meetings per year, and perhaps something between 30 and 100 people will show up for each meeting. Then there'll be a group which is all about Oracle's higher education products, and they might have 2 or 3 meetings, but perhaps there'll only be maybe 10 people who show up, and they'll perhaps show up and use an Oracle office, and they'll just sit in one of Oracle's offices in London or Birmingham. But we have a very large number of specialized subgroups which have a few meetings per year. And I tended to focus particularly on the group which is about the database server. So I did a lot of presentations. That was my, I think, biggest single contribution to the UK user group. I just loved going and standing up and saying, well, look, this is what Oracle can do, or explaining how to solve problems and things like this. And then, of course, it's just great fun having people to talk to afterwards. And and just the general chatter that goes on at these events. And obviously I was also involved with the board of directors for some time. It's now changed the structure a bit. I was on the council for some time. And of course there's always a lot of hard work there. Paperwork, paperwork and organisation work is not really the thing I do best. But we try very hard to balance the requirements of all the different communities that make up the Oracle user group, the UK user group. So there's always a lot going on in terms of who needs what, how do we find out what people would really like to see and so forth. Luckily, of course, because we've been going for so long and because we've built up such a large community, we actually have a dedicated office. The user group in the UK is a company, right? And we have an office which employs something like 20, 25 people. They're full-time employees of a company, and they spend all their time preparing events for us, organising events, finding places to go, and doing all the work which makes a conference possible. I mean, we have our own specialist events company, and this is absolutely brilliant. They do a huge amount of work to make the whole thing work.
It's excellent. Do you think this, the whole user group thing, do they influence Oracle or some development strategies maybe?
I think they can certainly have an input. One of the things the UK user group did each year was carry out a survey through all its members, and the membership numbers were, I think, 2,500, 3,000 in terms of large companies, and then maybe 7,000 or 8,000, I think, in terms of individuals. So there's a large body of people that we can actually survey. And in the survey, it's quite a long survey, quite a lot of detailed questions and so forth. We can summarise this information and we do present it back to Oracle in the UK. And there have clearly been occasions when Oracle has been able to take advantage of the information we've given them, and they've been interested and followed some of the directions that we've suggested would be helpful to our users. So I think because of our size, because we bring so many people together, we can act as a voice to Oracle, and Oracle will listen. Right? I suspect they will never listen as much as we would like them to listen, right? And they might think they're paying far too much attention to us sometimes, but there is certainly a channel between the user group and Oracle, and constructive results do come out from that channel. Right? And if the group wasn't there, I don't think individuals or even large companies would be able to get quite so much communication going between themselves and Oracle. So I think that's another important benefit of the user group. Once it's got enough bulk, once there are enough people, and you can turn around to Oracle and say, well, look, we asked 1,000 people, and 80% of them said they really wanted to see something like this, and that's a lot of people, and that's enough people to make Oracle think, okay, let's investigate that, or let's try and address something in that area.
That's really great, and I think it could be quite good if user group can share their experience of what they did. I mean, they did a survey, they get some feedback from users, and they provide it to Oracle, and maybe in 5 years' time or 7 years' time, something's changed. And I think it would be great to publish the whole results of the achievement of the user group, to make other user groups continue this work.
Give them an incentive, or let them see that something does happen. I think we probably do let people know, but I'm not sure. I mean, it's a very good thought. I mean, maybe we don't make it visible enough that we have had this input, and what the focus or what the voice from the end users was. And obviously, once we've got the surveys in, we do publish summary information on the user group website about, this was the broad picture we got from our survey. This is the message we passed to Oracle. But I don't think, I'll have to check this, I really will have to check this. I don't think we then have something which says, a year and a half later, we said this to Oracle, and if you notice, Oracle has done this, and this. I think we go back and say to the users, we do make a difference, right? But I don't think we actually make it very, very clear. I don't think we document and list the things where we can say, well, because you told us you wanted this, look, Oracle has done so and so. And perhaps we ought to make that much more obvious. Yes.
It could sound so perfect.
Yeah. Yes. And it helps not just us to encourage our membership, but it would be a beacon, a sign to other user groups as well.
Yes, and it could involve more people to the UK Oracle group,
yes.
Because it is such strong group. That's a very nice way of user groups. Thank you. Continue to the other type of the group, which has been formed by some people from the UK. I mean, Oak Table Network. It's a special kind of group. Could you tell us more about it?
Right, the Oak Table Network. It's quite difficult to say what the Oak Table Network is. In a way, it's a bit like a club, right? It's we do technically have, let's think, I think it's a trademark or it might be a copyright mark. I mean, we have some sort of legal claim to the name Oak Table Network. But really, it's just a sort of group of like-minded people. And it started 10, 12 years ago, I think. Mogens Norgaard, I think Mogens Norgaard comes from Denmark. He's probably the focal point, if you like, of the Oak Table, because he had arranged a little conference in Denmark, just a 2 or 3 day thing. In fact, it might have been a conference where I was the only speaker. That it was perhaps the first time I did my Oracle seminar, my internals seminar in Denmark. And the thing was that I said I'd go and do this, and then he started sending me email like, well, Carrie Millsap's coming over from America, and Anya Colt's coming over from the Netherlands, and Steve Adams is coming all the way from Australia. And of course I was getting more and more panicked because every famous name, every competent expert in the Oracle world seemed to be traveling to Denmark, and I was supposed to stand up in front of them. But then I think it turned out that we were all just enthusiasts. We really just enjoyed what we were doing, and we were interested and interested in each other's problems and questions and so forth. And it got to the sort of stage where we were sitting around the kitchen table in Mogens' room, and it was a huge oak table, and it's something like, I don't know, maybe. Oh, it's more than 2 meters long. I mean, it's really, really a big thing. You could easily sit 10, 12 people around it very easily. And so we were all sitting there, and we were all sitting there typing away at our laptops and saying, do you know if you do so-and-so, this is what happens? And someone else saying, I've been trying to solve this problem. And someone at the other end of the table was saying, okay, let me just work on that one, because I think I know the answer. And there's this endless conversation going on. And it stopped about 4 o'clock in the morning. And I was supposed to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning and start speaking at 9 o'clock in the morning. But at one point it was along the lines of, okay, the pizzas have just arrived or dinner's just arrived, so everyone just shut the lids on their laptops, put the plates on top of the laptops, started eating, finished dinner, opened up the laptops, and it's completely mad. I mean, this was when we were 10 or 12 years younger, but it was just a very enjoyable meeting of lots of similar-minded people, and basically Mogens said, we should do this again. We should form ourselves into a club. We should make sure that we do this again. We're going to be the Oak Table Network, and that was it, right? And it started off with about 10 people, I think. But gradually over time, individuals in the group have said, well, I've been working with this person, or we 2 or 3 of us have a history of working with an individual, and shall we just invite them to be a member? And it's terribly undemocratic. It's terribly unfair. There are no doubt lots of people who could say, well, yes, well, I'm good enough, I deserve to be a member. Well, it's really just, people meet people and they chat and they exchange email, and it's just a club for friends who happen to be very, very keen in Oracle. And occasionally we just say, hey, well, let's invite him in as well. There's nothing terribly formal about it, but people tend to recognise that if you're actually a member of the Oak Table, you must have been pretty good at Oracle at some stage. Right?
Yeah, that's...
and of course you are a member of the Oak Table, aren't you?
Still.
Yes, yes.
What do you think will be the future of this group of people? Club?
Well, I think the club will just carry on. In a way, it's just like a private mailing list. Right? Most of the time, it's just a private mailing list. But of course, there are loads of conferences all over the world. And Open World, for example, I can't think how many members of the Oak Table went to Open World, and we had a mini Oak Table conference in Open World, and RMARC, the Rocky Mountain User Group. Quite a lot of Oak Table members go to that one. And again, there's a sort of, not quite a mini conference, but there's certainly lots of them get together and there's a big dinner out type of thing. So it's really just a friendly club, an email chat room almost, just for people who are fanatic and interested in Oracle. I think pretty much that's all it will be. I don't think we'll ever try and organise a takeover of any user group or organise a takeover of Oracle Corporation or anything. It's just a way of keeping in touch with people who are very similar-minded. And the group will probably grow and a little bit, but nothing terribly dramatic. Okay. It's just fun.
Yeah, indeed. And about your public activity, some years ago, I think it was 7 years ago, 7 years before, right now, you published your notes and your findings and your scripts on a special website.
Yes.
And it was something like living document or so. And you continued to change it over time.
Yes.
And then you went to the blog. I think it was 7 years ago.
About 7 years ago, I think now. It seems a long time, yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. And do you think it was the right idea?
I think so. The original website, I don't think I would have said it was ever a living document. I mean, occasionally I corrected mistakes which I had found. And I did try and set up a frequently asked questions thing where people could email me a question which they needed answered, and I'd put it on the list and allow anyone to write in a standardized format a response to that question. So that was quite dynamic. The trouble with that thing was that I didn't really get many people contributing articles. There were a few people who sent in several, but didn't get much contribution, much feedback on that. And then I thought eventually, well, this blog thing, dialogue is important, feedback is important, people contributing more. You know, if you get 5 people coming together, the combination of what they say can often be much more important than what any one individual can say, and they can fill in the little gaps that other people leave. So I thought the blog would be a good idea. I'd write something and perhaps this would prompt a few other people to say, well, here's an extra little bit of information that fits, or you know, you haven't answered this particular detail, have you got some further comments that would address this particular part of it? It never really actually turned into quite that sort of cumulative thing. I mean, in a way, the blog is more the living document thing than the website ever was. But it never really turned into that. And in fact, I have to say that one of the problems I have when people do write comments and ask questions, and this particularly has come up with the addendum and the errors pages for my books. When they do ask questions, it's very hard to find time to work out good answers to those questions. So even though in principle I like the idea of much more of, I'll publish something in the blog and then we can talk about it afterwards, right? It's actually very, very difficult to do the talk about it afterwards bit, and I've never quite made it work. The principle is good, but it's very hard keeping up with it. But it is a better, I think it's a better idea than the old website was. Absolutely,
and it appears that some people just discuss some things in your comments, and which is great.
Yes, yes. I mean, from time to time, you know, I disappear somewhere and don't have time to even look at my own blog, and you know, I come back a week later and find that 7 or 8 articles have gone back and forth between other people saying, well, yes, Jonathan, how do you do so-and-so? You said on your blog this, and I haven't seen that question, but someone else has answered it, and someone else has chipped in with, oh yes, but you've got it. And then that works, to me, that works perfectly. And of course, I do still have a sort of overall view which says if someone actually writes something which I know is definitely wrong, I can make sure it doesn't stay there. Right? And that, of course, is one of the problems by comparison with things like OTN, right? And the database forums. You often see people coming up with a question, and some of the responses to that question are actually very, very bad answers. But of course, if someone's asking the question, they can't tell the difference between a good answer and a bad answer, right? And quite often you see this thing where someone sort of gives a gold star to someone and says, "Oh, great, that was really helpful, thank you very much." And you look at it and think, no, you definitely don't want to do that, right? But there's no proper mechanism for eliminating the bad stuff and reinforcing the good stuff, right? And if you're going to have a completely open arena for dialogue, you need a mechanism which eliminates the stuff that's going to be unhelpful and highlights the stuff that could be helpful. And of course the problem is there is so much stuff. The sheer volume of what you need to know is so great that it really isn't possible for someone to be the moderator for, well, even just the OTN database forum bit, right? No one knows enough to be able to go through and just clean up and tidy up these things. And the software, just as an example, the software that Oracle has currently got doesn't allow other people to read these threads and say, no, that is a bad answer. They actually have to contribute to the thread. So you end up with something which is, here's a question, here's 3 bad answers, here's 1 good answer, here's a comment which says the first bad answer is a bad answer, and then there's a good answer, then there's another bad answer, then there's another comment which says the second bad answer is a bad, you know, and anyone who's reading that stuff probably stops after 2 or 3 entries because they think they've got an answer and they never get down to the bit which says, well, the first thing you read wasn't the right answer. Right? So the information that's poor information, that's bad information, just keeps reinforcing itself, it just keeps existing, when really you'd like the bad stuff to die. Right?
But it's impossible to kill information.
It's impossible. You know, yes, the internet saves everything, right? And it's too big a job for any individual to be responsible for going and cleaning up the mess. At least on my blog, if someone puts something which is complete rubbish, I can go back and I might actually temporarily put in a reply which says, no, that's not the right answer because X, Y, Z. And then perhaps, you know, 6 months later, when people have been able to examine the wrong answer and the explanation of why it's the wrong answer, I'll just delete it so that the wrong answer just doesn't persist. Right? And I'll delete the wrong answer and my response to the wrong answer. Luckily, that doesn't happen very often, in fact. Yes. Yeah. But at least the environment makes it possible for that to work.
I think it works great.
Thank you.
And comparing blogging and commenting on forums with something which is considered now maybe some old stuff, like old-fashioned magazines. Oracle publishes its magazine, yes. Oracle magazine.
Yes.
UK Oracle User Group publishes a magazine which is called Oracle Scene.
Yes.
And there are a couple of other magazines like Northern California Oracle User Group magazine, which is quite good and available to all people around the world. Do you think it's still relevant to publish a magazine?
I think many people still like having a physical object in their hands to read, so there's quite a lot of people who would be happy to have the magazine. I think possibly, though, the more important feature of the magazine is that it reminds the users, the user group, that there are experts in the user group who can be helpful. It reminds people that it's possible to have a dialogue, that it's possible to come together in the group. If you look at Oracle's magazine, for example, or if you look at well, any of the magazines, you've mentioned the Northern California user group, you've mentioned Oracle Scene. If you look at any of them, it's a small number of pages. You know, it's 32 pages or 60 pages, and it comes out, well, the Oracle Scene is 3 times a year, I think, at present. The Oracle magazine itself, I think, is 4 times a year. It's a tiny amount of information compared to the enormous amount you need to know. And it's a little bit here, a little bit there. And the Oracle scene has a section, we try to spread and cover the field, but we have a section which is database technology. We have a section which is particularly e-business suite. We have a section which is developers. Well, if you think of all the different things that Oracle has got as products, you end up, well, it's not quite this bad, with one page is for this group of people, one page is for that group. You get a small number of articles. It's a very thin covering. Right? So no one gets a large amount of helpful information from the magazine, but what they do get is this sense which says there are people out there who have this information and the user group can pull us together. And it reminds people that it's worth going to user group meetings. It reminds people it's worth going to the conference where they can meet other people and they can spend more time and learn much more by having the conversations. Right? So it's a good reminder to people. I mean, from the user group perspective, it's a good reminder to people that there is a user group and that there are people who can help.
Yeah, that's really great. Sorry. Yeah. Continuing to some more technical questions and I think interesting stuff. You are considered one of the major experts, most well-known experts on the optimizer.
Right, yes.
And your book, Cost-Based Oracle Fundamentals, is a really fascinating book, which covers some specifics of the optimizer. What do you think about the future developments of this piece of software, of Oracle database software? I mean, optimizer. What is the future to the optimizer? How it will be developed?
Right. Now, really, the question there is, what do I think Oracle ought to do, I suppose, rather than what do I think Oracle is going to do?
Probably.
Yes.
Probably, yes.
That's a very tricky question. There are days when I love the Oracle optimizer, and I think the optimization that Oracle does, the algorithms it's got, the ideas built into it, the transformation capability, I think it's absolutely fantastic. It's brilliant. Right? And then there are days I hate the optimizer because of the silly little mistakes it makes and the things which I can't change when I know they could be changed. And what I'd really like Oracle to do is stop getting too clever. Right? I think they try to do some very sophisticated, very subtle things. And there are a lot of little details left behind which could be corrected, could be enhanced and could be improved, but because there's a massive push, it seems, to add new features, new transformations, new sophisticated logic to the optimizer, a lot of the little details get left behind. They don't get fixed. And one of the problems that then follows on from the little details not being fixed is when you get to doing some sophisticated transformation, you find that if Oracle does transformation A, some little features of the basic arithmetic say, well, the number of rows is going to be 100, but if you do transformation B, some odd little quirk in some other part of the code says, because you're doing it this way, the number of rows is going to be 5,000. And of course, you get this massive capability of Oracle switching catastrophically between two different plans because of not the sophisticated bits, but because of the very simple bits way, way back in the processing where two things which should say the same thing say different things. Now, in the talk I gave yesterday, I showed you that example which said, here is a query. All I have got is a single table and a 2-column index, and when I run the query, select where column 1 equals and column 2 equals. Here, in 3 consecutive versions of Oracle, are 3 completely different calculations as to how many rows you get and how much work you have to do. Right? Well, how much simpler can you get than select from a table by index equals constant. Right? And yet it wasn't till 11.1 that Oracle came up with something which said, oh, I do actually have enough information to have a very good estimate of both the cardinality and the cost of that query. Right? 3 phases. What was it? I showed you 10.1, 10.2.05, 11.1.07, I think it was. 3 completely different calculations. Right? Now, there are other oddities. Whenever you look very, very closely, of course, I often, because I'm solving problems for people, trying to find out why things have gone wrong, I often look very closely at some of the bits of arithmetic the optimizer does. And it's astonishing that whenever I look really closely at how some little detail works, I end up thinking, well, that's strange. This part here is not consistent with that part there. Or we've lost a little bit of information. And some of these things are incredibly silly. You find little bugs where you say, well, Oracle has obviously created an array which lists all the indexes which are relevant, but for some reason it's ignoring the first index. And you think about it for a bit and you rename the indexes or create a new one or drop the first one, and after a while you think, well, it looks as if what's happened is that some programmer has created this array and they started counting from 0 when they created it, but they started counting from 1 when they were using it, right? And you always lose the first index. Really strange things like this can happen, right? Or worse still, you get something which says, well, we've got 8 indexes on this particular table here, and I'm going to do a bitmap conversion on these indexes, so I'll work out the cost of using the first one, and that seems good, and I'll work out the cost of using the second one as well, and that seems good, and so does the third one and the fourth one. And you look at the arithmetic, and it's not used the costs of the 8 consecutive indexes, it's used the cost of the first index 8 times, and I forget which version that was, or whether it's been fixed even. I have to go and check that one. But you see these things where someone's forgotten to increment a counter, right?
Simple
and incredibly simple things like that, which lead to odd inconsistencies. And you can look back at this and think, well, how can something which says, should I unnest this subquery and do complex remerging at this point, how can that possibly make the right decisions if it can't even work out what the cost is and how many rows it's going to get when it's just accessing the data to start with? Right? So I'd like to see someone going back and looking
small things.
Yeah, the little details to make sure that first, these things are fixed, and also that if someone says, well, we've got this transformation A or transformation B on this query, why do we not get the same costing at the end of that transformation and the same estimate of cardinality? What's inconsistent? Where did the inconsistency arise? And then that might highlight some strategy for getting better results. Okay. But I would like to see that. I mean, having said that, Mohamed Zahid, I saw him quite recently in Switzerland with Christian Antognini, did a presentation, and one of the wonderful things he showed was how Oracle had, in a very recent version, gone back and re-engineered star transformations. And you got a real sense from that of how incredibly difficult it is to change the optimizer, because there are so many interwoven links in all the different little components, and by the time, and I think he said it took something like 2.5 years, right, to re-engineer this, because by the time he'd finished, or his designers and programs had finished, the star transformation was now something which fitted in, if I say orthogonally, right. It's, in a sense, independently of other transformations. So you could do ABC and star transform, or you could star transform then do ABC. You could do some of this business of table elimination, so one of these partition table tricks, in the middle of a star transformation, or you could do a star transformation and then table eliminate. So you could fit it in when it became appropriate to fit in. Whereas previously you had strange things like, if you put a subquery factoring clause with a subquery, and what you put in that was a something that could be star transformed, right? Oracle couldn't do a star transformation because it was inside with subquery. And you see simple examples like this. People say, well, why didn't Oracle do X, Y, Z? And the answer is, well, because you're doing A, X, Y, Z is not legal. Okay? In theory, it ought to be legal, but it just happens that it's not. Well,
possibly yet.
Well, exactly, yes. And this was the thing with star transformations. Right? If it's a with subquery, you cannot star transform. There's no reason why not, except you can't. Right? And then 2.5 years of engineering, right, and you can. So it's immensely complex to go back and make these little changes. And of course, when you make changes, if the cardinality estimates change or the cost estimate changes, right, someone's going to sit there and say, why did my query plan change? It used to be good and now it's bad. Anything you do, anything that changes the optimizer will make somebody unhappy, right? And the people who are unhappy will make a loud noise. The people who think it's great and massively improved won't say a thing. They're not going to stand up and say, Oracle, fantastic, wonderful, thank you very much, right? The only people who say things are the people who complain. So Oracle Corporation cannot win on optimization. Whatever they do, they're in the wrong. But, yeah, but it would be nice. I would like to see some of these funny little details cleaned up and the simple stuff. Most people end up with simple stuff, I think. That I think there could be some improvement there.
So your thought on this is optimizer will develop not how to say it. Sorry. It won't be redesigned.
No.
At one point, they did redesign it, and they introduced the optimizer,
yes.
cost-based optimizer. So you don't think at some point in the future they will need some
start all over again and just
yes.
Yes. Yes, I can't imagine a complete redesign from the ground up of the whole optimizer. And I believe there was somewhere around version 7 there was a big push in Oracle to do a massive redesign of parts of Oracle, which of course took a lot of time, took a lot of money. I can't really imagine any company saying, well, we've got this product, it works fantastically well a huge fraction of the time, but we're going to start all over again, right? And we're going to spend a huge amount of time and a huge amount of money not making any difference to all our customers. It just doesn't happen. I think it's extraordinary that they spent so much time working on the star transformation bit, and I think we might see various pieces being re-engineered, but I can't quite imagine anyone from Oracle Corporation saying we will now fund a complete new cost-based optimizer. And it can do so many things, right, that it would be very hard to, perhaps even to write down the specification of what it's got to do and roughly how it's got to do it. Right? So no, incremental changes, a little bit of evolution, a little bit of runaway growth, occasional bits of rationalization, but not a complete re-engineering. I would be very surprised.
Yeah, evolution, not revolution.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, that's reasonable. Another product, not product, but option. One of the options of the Oracle is real application clusters. That's not cheap option, definitely. And in the late time, I think it becomes so common, especially with the introduction of engineered systems, and it became very popular. So what is your view on this option, and do you think in the future all Oracle installation will be rack, for example, or we will see some single instance databases?
That's a very difficult one. I think it comes down to what Oracle would like you to buy, or what rather they would like to sell to you, which isn't necessarily the same thing. In a way, I think rack has outlived its usefulness. And there was a time when something like rack was necessary for scalability. Oracle also used to sell it to you in terms of high availability, but so many of the sites I saw, it was only highly available if you got in a massive team of really competent experts who day and night watched it carefully to make sure it didn't fall over. It was too fragile. There were too many dependent little pieces which could possibly go wrong. And I think perhaps, in part, this is why Oracle allowed RAC to go down into, there's a standard edition RAC, a very cheap version of RAC, right? Because if you've only got 50 customers using RAC, it takes a long time to find all the bits which are broken. Right? If you can push out a cheap version of RAC and you've got 10,000 customers using RAC, you'll get lots of problems. All your field testing goes on in your cheap customers, you can figure out what you've got to do better. So I think there was certainly a push to move out RAC as much as possible because it helped develop the product and make it more stable and easier to handle and so forth. But I think, I mean this is speculation, this is hand waving. I think with the Exadata construct, well, Exadata is RAC in a box, right? ODA is RAC in a box. In fact, probably grid in a box rather than rack in a box, cloud in a box, I suppose is the right terminology these days. The Exadata is rack in a box. It's using the technology which has now been field tested, but it's hiding the complexity by saying to the buyers, just buy the black box. You don't really need to know that it's rack underneath. And if you get platinum support, you don't even have to worry about fixes and upgrades because Oracle will just log onto your machine and patch the whole thing from top to bottom just like that. Right? And that's the sort of marketing strategy. Make Oracle a black box. The rack type stuff is just part of that black box. And I think, I can see the day when Oracle says, if you buy Oracle, what you're buying is a black box that runs Oracle. Oracle is everything. It's the whole stack from the database software through the network software down to the cluster software down to the disks. The whole thing is just Oracle. You do not need to know that it's rack, that it's this high-speed network, that it's this layout of disks. Right? So rack was a step towards the complete black box solution. I think that's it. And given enough time, and probably won't be a great deal of time, I think you'd see Oracle saying, well, we would prefer it if people did not buy a couple of big IBM boxes and link them together as a rack system. Right? The only rack systems should be the rack systems which are inside an Exadata or an Oracle appliance type thing. And if you want anything else, well, you can buy a single instance Oracle and run it on your big machine, and that's it. But rack is perhaps it wasn't seen this way in advance, but I think you can look backwards and say, well, rack was an important step towards Exadata, towards ODA, towards the whole cloud thing.
Okay, and considering one of the chapters of your latest book, Oracle Core,
yeah.
It has a rack in its name, and
yes,
a rack and ruin.
Rack and ruin, yes. Now, I mean, rack and ruin has to the English ear, I hope, it has a nice sort of poetic flow to it. It's for the sound. I mean, it's just a phrase that comes nicely to mind. I did explain carefully in the book that this was for alliterative effect, I think is how I put it, rack and ruin. I was not claiming that if you got rack, you were bound to ruin everything. Okay, so that wasn't the intent. It just flowed nicely as a title. Although I then did actually follow up that in fact, it is relatively easy to ruin things if you don't think a little bit about how rack is different from single instance. And of course, you do have this business that if you've got multiple instances, multiple memory images of data and lock states and all the rest of it, you've got to get your machines to communicate. And essentially the ideal with rack then is to minimize the communication because you don't want to waste time talking about what you want to do, you just want to do it. Right? So there was a little bit of a ruin in the book, but the title was really for the sound of the title, not for the intent, the meaning. Yes.
Yeah, I understand that. And considering your clients and your consulting work, do you suggest rack to your clients often?
Very rarely. And this is not because I have a bias against rack. And as I said, in a sense, rack, it has almost had its day. I don't think rack is the strategic thing. I think if I were to say to someone, it looks like you need a rack solution, I would probably end up saying it looks like you need an Exadata solution. Okay, but essentially, rack came out as a mechanism for saying we can't get a machine which is big enough to do all the work we need to do, so let us tie several machines together. Well, nowadays you have to have a horrendous, complicated, enormous workload before you need more than one machine to do it. You know, do something terribly simple. You know, single machine, single instance. You can do so much. I mean, the machines nowadays are just so powerful, and the network cards you can plug in, pump out stuff so fast. The SANs, if configured correctly, and if you're really, really busy, you have your own dedicated SAN. The disks you can connect to can cope with so much information that you don't need to double up machines in order to get the performance and the throughput. And when it comes to high availability, 15 years ago, I think, a good high availability solution, which has only got better, coming from the operating system. You had things which would say, if this machine number 1 fails, we can just switch a logical machine over to machine number 2, and it will be up and running within minutes, right? It gets faster and faster, of course. So just simply something which says, fail over at the operating system level and restart. That's the sort of resilience which is almost invariably totally adequate for most customers. And of course we then have things like the sort of virtual machine system anyway, where VMware with their I forgot what they call it.
vMotion.
vMotion, that's it, yes. With that type of technology, you can even say, well, the machine I'm running on, my instance on at the moment isn't actually big enough, so let's buy a new bigger machine, and oh yes, next Saturday, without stopping anything, we'll just slide our virtual machine from my little box over to my big box. You know, it's ridiculous what you can do with hardware these days with the layers of software and the management stuff that sort of can sit underneath it. So rack, I don't really see any great point in suggesting to someone that they need to buy rack. I've never come across a client, not for years, where I've said the only sensible solution is rack. Okay, and rack does require some complex management, complex configuration. It is still, if you're doing a homegrown type thing, it is still a bit fragile around the edges.
Yeah.
And there are people who are very good with rack, mind you. I could name you half a dozen Oak Table members who are fantastic with rack, right? But you know, for the ordinary business people, it's fragile around the edges.
Yeah, yeah, great. And continuing to other developments of Oracle and the upcoming next Oracle database release 12c. It was announced on Oracle Open World.
Right.
Previous almost 1 year, and since then a lot of people started to talk about new features. And what you heard about them, some of them.
Yes.
What is your most favorite?
New features in Oracle 12c. Well, I mean, my sources of information, basically, of course, that I can mention are the presentations I went to at Open World, as you say, last year. Of course, when you see those presentations, the first thing Oracle puts up as their first slide is, there's no guarantee we're going to do this. This is what we would quite like to do and what we quite might actually deliver you, but there is absolutely, they call it their safe harbor statement. So you can see all this stuff and you don't absolutely know that it's going to appear. The thing I think that struck me most significantly was that there are a number of enhancements with partitioning which allow you to use them in a more natural way, that let you do things which you would have thought you could perhaps have done 10 years ago. So details to do with referential integrity and how things behave if you want to drop old partitions, and things happen, things cascade normally. You don't have problems with maintaining referential integrity if you've declared it at a partition type level. Interestingly, there's even one little detail with partition tables. You can rebuild a table online, provided what you're actually rebuilding is a partition of a partition table. Right? So you can actually say things like, every month I will make a partition read-only. So 12 months after the date has appeared, I'll make that partition read-only. You can actually say things like, I might get the syntax wrong, alter table, move this partition into a different table space with compression as high as I would like to do it online. Right? So the application can still keep running quite happily, and that data will move, and the indexes will be rebuilt online. And that's a nice little touch, and an important little touch. So that's one of the nice things. I think that there are features there in partitioning which will be very helpful. The other thing, there have been changes in the way the optimizer works, particularly in terms of some of the stats collection, and especially histograms. Right. Now, I know the histograms, because I paid close attention to the presentation on histograms open world, because I was the one giving it. But histograms in 12C are much more efficient at collection, and the quality of information you get in a histogram is much better. Now, generally speaking, I always warn people to be very, very cautious about creating histograms, and only create them if they really are confident that they need them and will use them effectively. But it is a nice feature of 12C that the histogram definitions, the strategy, the collection costs, and all the rest of it, everything about histograms is much nicer in 12C. So those are the two key things which struck me about 12C as very worthwhile improvements. Loads of other bits and pieces, little bits and pieces around the edge. I mean, one of the things you'll hear about 12C, of course, most commonly is pluggable database. Right?
Think about that.
Doesn't get me excited at all. You know?
Really?
Okay, so you've got pluggable databases. You know, SQL Server did that 20 years ago or something. I exaggerate, but you know, it's okay. So I can appreciate that there is a benefit, and most particularly, there is a benefit to Oracle Corporation of having pluggable databases. Because right now, if you run up an Oracle 11 rack with a few bits and pieces, features added on like standby database, and you look at the number of processes running on your Unix box, there's something like 45 or 50. Well, an instance to run needs 50 processes. Well, if you've got 12 instances, 12 databases, and you want to consolidate onto one machine, well, you can't actually just put 12 databases and 12 instances on one machine, because you've now got 600 processes running on that machine before you even get end users connected. And it has to be a very, very big machine to handle even idle processes when there are 600 processes. So Oracle would, of course, like to say, we'll put it all in one database and only run 50 processes. Right? So your sort of background process overhead, your simple operating system housekeeping for background processes is much less significant. Right? Well, actually taking an application and physically saying, well, let's make it a schema and put that schema into a database is very hard work. But if you can say, let's create a container database which has 50 processes, and then we can move a pluggable database in, it's easy. In principle, nothing changes. The plugged database doesn't know it's inside a container. Right? It just happens that the container is the only thing that needs to run processes. So you can see from Oracle's perspective, it's easier for them to say, you can do consolidation with Oracle because you just put all your databases into one, and you're actually only running one database which is holding all these pluggable databases. It benefits Oracle. It's a convergence, a consolidation convenience for the customers. But people it really benefits is Oracle, because it lets them sell Oracle more easily.
Don't you think this is, container databases are changing their architecture considerably?
I suspect that they don't have to change the architecture very much. I don't think it's a whole re-engineering job. I think there are probably a few key points where they have to make very careful changes. One of the questions I asked one of the architects, I think it was, or designers, when I was at Open World and had a chat on one of the stands was, well, the first thing that crossed my mind is this. If you have 6 copies of eBusiness Suite running on 6 separate databases, and you now put them into one database, pick a very common SQL statement. There are now 6 times as many copies of that SQL statement running as there used to be, or rather, there are 6 times as many executions of that statement. Isn't that going to introduce higher pressure on just a few mutexes? I would have said latches a couple of years ago, just a few mutexes, because more people are running that one statement concurrently. Right? And the basic answer to that question was, well, at present, all our hashing algorithms are based on the SQL text. Right? If you go to pluggable databases, your hashing algorithms are based on the SQL text and the container ID. So 2 statements which are the same, but from different plugged databases, actually hash to different locations. So you don't end up with hotspots becoming n times as hot. Right? So you could imagine that there are a few critical places where Oracle says we have to bring in this one extra value, this container ID for each of the plugged databases. But otherwise, provided we remember to do that, everything else is pretty much the same as it used to be. And you could imagine that, okay? Whether it actually took, I mean, obviously it's one of these things where someone says, okay, so we've got 10 million lines of code, we only need to change 5 concepts, right? So it's easy, there are only 5 things that need to change. Now, can we find all the occurrences of those 5 things? And you can almost guarantee that one day someone will come along and say, well, if you do this and this and this, and you're using this feature, and you've got such and such going on at the same time, you missed one, right? So, huge amount of work to make the change, but conceptually, it could be relatively easy, right? Conceptually. Physically, hard work, but conceptually, straightforward.
Have you heard about threaded database?
About?
Threaded database. They did something with the way they manage processes.
Oh, right, yes. Yeah.
And there was an article on some site which talks about the way the Oracle will use processes in the 12c.
Right.
And it seems like they will do some curious stuff, which is similar to a shared server,
right.
but
yes.
dedicated.
Right. I don't think I've read that. One of the other thoughts that crossed my mind is that the single hottest point in any Oracle database ends up as being the log writer. Right? The rate at which the database can change is dependent upon the log writer. Well, if you've got 6 busy databases with 6 busy log writers, and you put them all into one container, if the container only has one log writer process, it will not keep up with 6 lots of log being generated. Therefore, Oracle must have done something about making, as you say, threading, some sort of threading with the log writer to say somehow, even if we only have one log writer, it has to be multi-processing. Somehow the log writer has to work a lot faster. So perhaps one of the things we may see, and perhaps the most critical and complicated bit that Oracle has to do, is work out how to handle the log writer. And yes, I think I've seen something about, I think it was, the expression was threaded redo. I can't remember where I read it, but there was threaded redo, and something very different about what goes on with the log writer. And yes, there may be interesting things happening there. And certainly if I wanted to run up some testing, let's see how easily I can break it type testing. Now, that's my speciality, right? If you want me to break something, I'll find a way of breaking it before it goes production. Right? Always break it as soon as you can. Know what's going to break in production by trying to break it first in test. It would be, I think I'd try and put pressure on the log writer to run as many databases plugged as possible, which are all trying to generate lots of log, just to find out exactly what Oracle did in terms of handling excessive amounts of log if it's still only got one log writer process.
A question.
Yes.
How much is a much? You told excessive amounts of
What's an excessive amount of redo log? Yeah. Oh yeah. Yes. I often point out that if someone says, if this number is large, well, large doesn't mean anything. It doesn't tell you anything. And the problem, of course, is that sometimes it's just not possible to put an absolute number in place. If you've got 2 CPUs and 4 gig of memory, something you think is very big is completely ignorable as far as someone else is concerned if they've got 168 CPUs and 320 gig of memory. So large always turns into some sort of comparison between the amount of work you think you have to do and the amount of hardware you've got to do it with. So you have to watch out for that one. But if you think about the log writer basically says something like, every time you commit or every megabyte flush, I will actually write to disk and just write continuously to disk at the end of a file. Occasionally I switch log files to keep on going. I am just streaming out continuously to disk. Well, if you said something like, how fast can you actually do a DD? How fast can you literally copy physically a file from one location to a different disk? What's the fastest you can write to disk? And you might say something like, well, if it's a continuous stream, 300 megabytes per second, maybe, so long as you've got some SSD sitting there in the middle to help out a little bit, to accumulate lots of little writes into big writes and then pump out big writes down onto the physical disk. A figure like that. Well, if I have an application which generates 40 megabytes per second when it's just normally running, bear in mind when I say that, the log writer, people often say we will duplex. We've got to make 2 copies. So that 40 megabytes I'm writing is actually 2 lots of 20, right? Things like that come into play. But if I've got something generating 40 megabytes of actual log per second, and then I say, and now I've got 10 copies of this application, right, there you go, 400 megabytes per second. Can I get that down to disk? That's big.
Yes,
but
absolutely.
yeah, it big depends on what you've actually got to use. But you can see that there are simple mechanical limits at some stage where you can say, if this number goes beyond X, that's what my disk can do. That's it. That's the fastest I can change the database.
I've seen some AWR reports on the Twitter, which told me some incredible numbers about redo generation.
Yeah.
Like 600 megabytes per second,
Right,
or
okay.
1 gigabyte per second.
Right.
And this is on simple 2-socket boxes.
Sorry, on
On a two-socket server.
right, okay.
On a simple service, which also are part of the Exadata.
Yeah.
But with some flash-based storage
Right.
system.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, I think at that sort of rate, you've got to have some sort of. You don't have disks. You have flash. Yes, you have some sort of solid-state mechanism behind it. Yeah. Trouble with that is that you can go on for a certain amount of time, right? And at some stage, and particularly if you're archive log mode, you've got to destage from your solid-state disk onto a physically cheaper medium, like spinning disks or tapes even maybe. But you get your high speed from solid state, but that's quite expensive. And if you keep on doing it, you fill up your solid state. Well, eventually you've run out of solid state, right? And this is an interesting thing about benchmarks. You engineer your benchmarks very carefully to go as fast as possible for as long as it is necessary. And one of the old jokes about some of Oracle's benchmarks, the TPCC things, right? If the benchmark says you've got to be able to do this for this amount of time, you look at some of the ways in which Oracle has managed to go really, really quickly, and you think, well, yeah, that works, but if you had to carry on for another 2.5 hours, it would stop. You look at some of these and think that in real life you would not implement this way because it's not actually scalable. It's not a growing solution. It's a fixed size solution. And some of the things Oracle does with single table hash clusters are just a little bit naughty. The fastest way to get at a single row of data is if it's perfectly positioned in a single table hash cluster. But single table hash clusters have to be pre-declared. They are fixed size, right? And if you get it wrong and you start overflowing, things slow down dramatically. So
you have to be clever.
You have to be very, very well informed, and it's not a continuously growing solution. Right? It's very often a benchmark special. Everyone does it, right?
But not in real life.
But not in real life. Not in real life. No, I hope not. Yeah.
Apart from the database, Oracle has a big company business, and the latest trend in this business is new word, big data, and cloud.
Yes.
What do you think about this new stuff which comes up as NoSQL databases and some applications which Oracle starts selling, like big, like Exalytics, I think, or something like that.
Right. I haven't looked into this sort of area closely enough. I go to a few presentations at conferences and things like this. My feeling about the whole big data thing, I think it was Gwen Shapiro who sort of summed it up quite nicely when she explained or put across the concept that you can often get very interesting information if you do something very simple to a very large amount of data. And you can get better information, better understanding than if you do something very complex to a very small amount of data. Right? And this is, I mean, I don't know how well that covers the big data concept, but it seemed a very sensible observation. And my feeling about the big data business is that it doesn't matter if the data is wrong, right? Or rather, if it's not quite right. If you've got a vast amount of data and it's not quite up to date and it's not quite perfect, the sheer volume of what you've got that is correct means that when you do your big data analysis, the conclusions you draw from it are appropriate, right? So big data doesn't require
statistically significant.
Exactly. Right? What you're after with big data is statistical significance. It's relevance, and if your data's pretty close to correct, then your statistics and the volume is large, your statistical relevance will be appropriate. Whereas the relational database approach, relational theory, is a theory about ensuring that you can represent data absolutely correctly, or rather, if you create the model and you implement the model correctly, what you put into the model represents truth. It is self-consistent, it is correct within itself. And obviously you can create a model and then you can lie. You can say, okay, I can see I've got 10 boxes on the shelf, but I'm going to say I've got 8 boxes when I put it in the database. In that sense, the relational theory doesn't stop you from lying and getting the wrong answers. But the relational theory says if you actually take the truth from the real world and put it into the correct model in the database, what you've got in the database is correct, is true, and the database will ensure that the database is correct. Okay? And that's why billing systems use relational databases. They do not use, oh, statistically you probably owe us about 6,000 rubles, right? Okay, it's accurately you owe us 6,042 rubles and whatever it is, 10 kopecks, or is it kopecks? I'm sorry, I'm trying to be local and I should have checked my currencies before I did. Yeah, I mean, the relational database is correct, right? So it may end up that it handles, in general for most people, small data rather than big data, but big data doesn't have to be perfect. Relational systems exist because sometimes the data has to be perfect, right? So the relational won't go away. Whatever anyone says, relational won't go away because relational is a theoretical model. Right? Now, people may find mechanical ways of implementing it differently, but big data and NoSQL are not aimed at being implementations of relational theory.
As a replacement, it's not appropriate.
That is correct.
right now.
There may be things that people do at present with Oracle databases which have a vast amount of data in them, and maybe they'll look at that and say, well, you know, I'm paying for all this overhead to guarantee correctness of the data, but I don't actually need correct data. You know, and one of the clients I had some time back was one of the social networks. I won't say which one, but the social networks, and it was a database which was about who said what to whom in their little chat boxes and all the rest of it. Well, technically, you don't need to make sure that you capture every little comment that every person has made to every other person. If the database crashed and you lost just a little bit of data and the database came up again and someone said, I'm sure I told this person about my pet dog, right? But I can't see, well, it doesn't really matter terribly much. And you may find then that people who are running things like social networks on Oracle might say, well, actually, let's move it onto a completely different technology where I can get lots more people chatting and it's cheaper to run the data set that way. And if I do lose a tiny bit, they're not going to complain. Right? They may be surprised, they may be puzzled, they may be a little bit confused that something's gone missing, but, you know, by and large, so long as I get it pretty close, they won't complain. And maybe if something appears which disappeared for 24 hours because it was over on a different node and it finally filtered over to this node and it cleaned itself up a bit later, fine.
And there is the redundancy also.
Exactly, and there's the big data thing has, is it the HDFS and all the rest of this type of stuff allows for, you know, the data protect itself. It's the sort of internet database. You know, you can destroy bits of it, but the rest of it will work around the hole in the middle and fill in the gaps, type of thing. You know, there's very much that sort of, to my mind, that anyway, that sort of feel to the big data thing. It gets there. It gets there in the end, right? And some systems, it's perfectly okay to say it's not perfect all the time, but it's good enough. Yeah.
And another word which comes very often with big data is a cloud.
Mm-hmm, right.
And every person thinks different, I think, about the cloud.
The cloud, yeah. I'm not convinced that there is any direct connection between big data and the cloud. Mm-hmm. To me, when people say the cloud, my mind goes all the way back to about 1968, 1969, when a PDP-11 was top of the range, absolutely the most expensive, fantastically powerful computer. And people used to set up computing bureaus where you got onto a telephone line and you whistled down the telephone line and the computer understood the whistling. Right? It was, bureau computing. Right? The cloud to me is just a very modern equivalent of that. Right? We don't really need to know where the resources are. Things like vMotion let us move virtual computers from physical machine to physical machine without even stopping. Right? Well, the cloud simply says, I've got a load of computers here, they're very closely tied together. I can create a virtual computer out of however many of those real computers or even blades or bits in a single box that I need. Oh, and I don't really care whether it's one smallish box sitting in my server room or whether I actually slide the whole virtual machine over the internet into an enormous great box which is sitting in Redwood Shores. To me, that's all the cloud is. It's a way of saying, I need computer resources, I don't actually have to own them. Right? And it just happens that technology has moved on so much. And you look at things like the VMware type stuff, you look at things like RAC. RAC then went on to Grid, where Grid said we'll have a big RAC cluster, we'll have a 40-node RAC cluster, but 8 of those nodes will be my HR application, and 12 of those nodes will be my general ledger, and 22 of those nodes, if I've got enough left, will be my web application server type thing. Oh, and on Saturdays, the thing gets a bit busy, so we'll take some of the HR nodes off the HR cluster and a few off the GL cluster and move them to web cluster, and Sunday night we'll shift them back again. Right? So this was just Oracle moving nodes through the across clusters, across sort of the virtual database of the RAC clusters. Well, cloud is just more of the same. Right? We can move the resources where we need them, or put it another way around. If you want to buy resources off me, you don't need to know exactly where I've put those resources. Right? So it's nothing new and exciting, it's just bigger, right? Bigger and necessarily a lot faster. But it's just selling computer time, and we now have much better technology for selling much more computer time.
Yeah, indeed.
And you can start small. You can start, and this is Oracle and ODA. You can start with one little ODA sitting in your office, and there's a nice little sort of management interface, and you can even set it up so end users can say, you know, I'm allowed to ask for 6 CPUs if I need them, and then, you know, I'll run up the interface which says, build me a virtual system, build me a virtual web application server with database behind it, with just a few clicks of a button. But that little box can migrate its virtual systems up across the network, and you can put them onto a big box, or you can put them out into the internet and onto a third-party supplier. Well, third-party supplier means Oracle Corporation, ideally, but you know, yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much for this wonderful overview of this new technology.
Yeah.
And
I should put up one of these slides that Oracle does. You know, I might be completely wrong. I might change my mind later. Okay, but you know, that's just opinions. Okay, I'm not a technology. I'm not a technology forecasting guru. I could be quite off base on that sort of line of business.
Still, you sound very reasonable.
Yeah.
And I think you can't be mistaken too much.
Well, I hope not. Yes.
Okay, and I think, how much time do we have? How much time?
About
Yes.
10 minutes.
How long have we been going on for?
According to an hour.
Oh, so let's.
Do you want to wrap it up?
No, I think a couple of questions.
Yeah.
You are a book writer.
I am. Yes. Well,
Yes.
I have written books. Yes. Okay. Yes.
So far, it's 3 books. I think.
Yes. 3 books I've written, and 3 more I've contributed to.
Yes. Yes. And can you share us your experience? How difficult it is to write a book?
Extremely difficult. My view on the books I've written, the thing I was trying to achieve by writing the books was to tell a story. You know, you look at the Oracle manuals, and there's a huge amount of very useful information in them, and particularly over the last 3 or 4 years. I think possibly the best were Oracle 10.2 manuals, but over the last years, the quality of information is very, very good. But in many ways, it's fragmented. You have to know which bit you need to look at to understand what you need to do. So what I wanted to do in all of my books was try and pull everything together into a continuous story, so that you could begin at the beginning and walk through that and gradually learn and make more complex and more advanced your understanding of how Oracle worked. So my aim was always to have a narrative, right? Rather than, I could tell you 5,000 little things about Oracle, right? And it wouldn't help you very much unless there were a couple of them you really needed to know, right? Lots of little fragments, to my mind, is not helpful. I wanted to tell the whole story from end to end. And that's extremely difficult to start with, and actually structuring stories so that you can produce the flow. The other thing was, I know a huge number of pieces about how Oracle works, and I have a huge amount of information which allows me to look at a specific problem and say, all right, I can identify that the cause of this problem is approximately related to this particular feature, or this particular experience I've had before, or this bit of implementation which I've looked at very closely. But when I'm on site, I can then say, well, I know roughly what's going on. Now, that lets me build a little model or look a little more closely at what is actually happening in this specific case. And so I often know, say, 98% of what's happening, and for a client, on individual cases, I need to work out the last 2%. Well, that's great when you're writing a book, nearly, because you can write 10 pages and just write 10 pages and do 10 pages perhaps in a day as you go through the basic descriptions. And then you get to the point where you think, I've got one of these 2% points, right? I can't just write this sentence because I need to make sure I actually understand, or at least point out, the different things that could happen at this point. And so suddenly you sit there thinking, I want to write 2 lines. That's all I want to write, 2 lines. But I've got to check what actually happens. And then you spend the next 2 days setting up little models and just checking on if there are variations and when those variations appear and all the rest of it. And then you go back and say, in those 2 lines, however, remember that if you do so-and-so, this doesn't quite work the same way, right? And you will see this. And you spend 2 days writing 2 lines, having spent 1 day writing 10 pages. Right? And I mean, it's the Pareto rule, the 80-20 rule. Right? It's a bit like that. You write 80% of the book in 20% of the time, and you write 20% of the book in 80% of the time, except it's much worse than that. Right? You write 95% of the book in 5% of the time, and the last little bit of the book takes forever. Right? And you have to do it because you've got to get it as right as you can, because you can be so misleading if you say something like, oh yes, I've seen that happen once before, I'll tell everyone that that's how it works. And of course that's how it might work in 80% of the cases, and you've completely overlooked that lots of people do something a bit different you haven't catered for. And you can see this in lots of Oracle books, that really they're just collections of odds and ends that people have noticed in the past, or they've read it on the internet and they stick them all together into a book. And you read through some of the stuff and think, well, yeah, you have described a fairly common case, but you haven't allowed for, here are 10 common variations on that theme. And where's the thing which says, do not do this if you're doing X, Y, Z? Or it actually costs twice as much if you switch on auditing, or if you switch on a standby database, right? And you look at some of the experiments that people have done, the little models. People are getting a lot better, and people are getting a lot better at this. It's been improving hugely over the last 5 to 10 years, that people will actually say, here is a model, this shows you what happens, you can actually run this yourself and see it happen. But it's quite difficult to do that well, right? And building a sensible model it requires a great deal of skill, and it's very easy, no matter how good you are, it's very easy to make mistakes. Mainly mistakes of things you didn't think of checking, right? And I've actually got a presentation which lasts about an hour and a half, is how to test, right? Yeah. And one of the things is, well, you can do this, that's very simple, it gets you started, but you haven't done this, so we'll make the test more complicated. But you haven't allowed for this, so we'll make the test more complicated. And you get through to the end, but eventually you have something which says, I really need to model 25 individual sessions connecting to the database, or coming through a pool to the database, and inserting one row and committing and disappearing again. Because there are so many little optimizations. You go from something like create table as select to I've got 25 concurrent sessions at any one instant, randomly inserting data into this table, one row at a time. Right? You can validly make some comments about the data and how Oracle does things with that data on create table as select, but actually you do get to the cases where you need to say, well, that's not a valid model for a certain type of test, and instead of doing something which generates 6 million rows in 5 minutes, I have to run something which goes concurrently to generate 6 million rows in 45 minutes, right, before I actually start doing my test case, my real test. And you can see this in lots of examples that people have gone through the simpler cases, and yet there is still more. Have you allowed for this? Have you allowed for that? How the point comes as you progress through a test, as you progress through checking to see whether a concept could work in production. And this is where it becomes critical, of course. I said something about breaking things as quickly as possible. If you've got to produce a new piece of code, if you've got to implement a new bit of the application, you need to choose which Oracle features you're going to apply. You have to know how they work, you have to test them. And very often you can say, well, oh yeah, single table hash clusters, oh, that looks like a really brilliant idea, now let's start testing. And the idea is to say, well, what's the simplest test I can do that proves it's a bad idea? And you just go through that stage. It's always, if I've got 5 ideas, what's the simplest thing I can do to eliminate 4 of those ideas and not waste time chasing a bad idea? So you go from a very simple starting test in the hope that things will go wrong very early on. Okay? But eventually you do have to get to a very good test. You have to get to something that's close to realistic, and the closer you get to realism, the more time and effort it takes. Now, I can't remember what the original question was, right? But I think I probably said something interesting and useful. I hope I've said something interesting and useful there.
Absolutely. The question was about the books.
Oh yeah. Oh yes. It was the books. Yes, and it is the fact that you end up going to some of the really complicated tests and spending a lot of time. That's where the problem comes with the book. You know what the basic idea is, but sometimes you then have to spend a lot of time just to finish off a couple of sentences or 1 paragraph. You know. And yes, I often found that I would get to the point where I'd say, okay, all I want to write is a paragraph, and 2 days later I could write that paragraph, or sometimes not write that paragraph, write a completely different paragraph, because I'd discovered something new and different, because I was creating more realistic tests. Right? And the effort, I mean, the effort to get the last 5% is enormous. Right? And occasionally very frustrating. Yeah.
Any plans maybe for more books?
Not very strong ones. People do ask me from time to time, well, there was the suggestion from the CBO book, the Cost-Based Optimizer book, that there would be 2 more volumes. I think I said there might be, or you know, I have enough material for 2 more volumes. The problem is, this is why Oracle should go back and fix the old optimizer and not bring in new bits. Then I could keep up with them and actually sort of write a book about what happens. But they change the optimizer faster than I can write about it. Plus, of course, there are a number of really highly competent people now on the internet who actually do write stuff about the optimizer. So it's a lot easier for people to find out some of the stuff they need. I mean, my book gives you the basics. It gives you the core features that you need to know to recognize the sorts of basic problems. The later books were some of the more advanced stuff, some of the more the less common stuff. So I've decided that there's no way I can actually catch up and put all the rest in. Instead of being the 5% testing I have to do for the new bits, it would be half of it would be easy to write, 50% of it would be work at it and do all the tests. But I do have a thought that, I mean, I wrote Oracle Core, and I said there, I think it's roughly the first 2 chapters of Practical Oracle 8i, sort of revisited and made into a whole book. There is scope for a book called Oracle Structures. I've actually designed a seminar, a 2-day seminar for Oracle Structures, which is pretty much the rest of Practical Oracle 8i, but brought very much up to date. Because you look at most database systems and you have simple heap tables. Occasionally people use partitioning, of course, for big stuff, and B-tree indexes, or if it's a data warehouse, you get bitmap indexes. And you can engineer a lot of performance into a system if you know what physical structures are most appropriate for what you want to do. Right? And that book is a possible book. And I do have odd little thoughts and odd little notes about, well, I would quite like to write that book. And perhaps I could write it without having to do the 50%, maybe it would still be a 95-5 type of job. Right? So maybe, but no promises, there may be a book, Oracle Structures.
Right. We will hope so.
Yeah.
And as a closing question, tell us your favorite story about your consulting. Something best thing you did to your client.
I think the best story I can tell is the story that makes you realize how nobody is really, now how should I put this? What you think is the best thing you've ever done isn't what people want you for, right? Because the best thing I ever did, or rather the thing I did at one company, which I think has got me the loudest, wildest, most enthusiastic praise, right, was to fix the coffee machine.
Oh, really?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. I mean, they'd called me in because they had performance problems. That's why I ever go anywhere. We have well, actually, some people call me and say, "Well, could you do a sort of a day's briefing on Oracle to the development team or to the DBAs or whatever?" So sometimes my visits to companies are actually about training days and talking about Oracle, but mostly it's fix our performance problems, or at least tell us how to fix our performance problems. So I went into this company quite a long time ago now, and they had some really unpleasant SQL that was really quite difficult to work out what it's trying to do. And it would have been nice at that time to have all those little scripts that Carlos has got into his SQLT thing, because you needed to collect a huge amount of information about what they were trying to achieve with this SQL to understand what it was doing. DBAs didn't know what the business was doing. You had to reverse engineer from the SQL to what the requirement was. Complicated stuff. I picked up the worst one they had. It was quite long. It was 3 or 4 pages. Some people would say that's nothing, but it was difficult. It took me 2 or 3 hours to figure out what it was doing, find out what the logical flaws were in the way it was doing it, and write up a piece of SQL that did the same thing much faster. It was a classic sort of 2 hours dropped down to 3 minutes type of fix. So I got this done, and I called the DBAs over and said, okay, here's the query, this is what it's trying to do, this is why this version of it behaved badly, here's my version of it, this is why it's actually logically the same query, it will give you the same results, watch it run, bang, 3 minutes. And the DBA said, yeah, oh, right, fine, good, thanks. And off they went. Right? And I thought, well, I deserve a cup of coffee. I've done a really good job here. I'm going to make some coffee. I went into the kitchen. They had a wonderful espresso machine in the kitchen. And so I put the cup under it, pressed the button, and it went ka-donk, and the red light came up. Right? So I got a bit annoyed. So I took the machine apart, and I discovered that they were just sort of 4 pieces really, and someone had put them back in the wrong order. Right? So I took the machine apart, I checked there was coffee in it, I checked there was water in it, I checked that the reject container was empty and all the rest of it, took it apart, put it back together again, pressed the button, and the machine went and there's all these noises of espresso coming out of the machine. The DBAs came rushing into the kitchen. Wow, you fixed our coffee machine! Right? I thought, yeah, great. They're paying me to fix their database, but what do they really care about? I fixed the coffee machine. Right? And as someone once said, well, of course, yes, the coffee machine is the most important piece of kit in the IT department. But yeah, the best thing I ever did for a company, or the thing they appreciated most, fix the coffee machine. Right? Yeah. You're probably expecting it to be fix the database, but fixing the coffee machine, that's my proudest moment, or that's my happiest moment, shall we say. Yeah. I mean, obviously I've fixed the SQL, I've re-engineered databases, and I've had great fun explaining things to people. And it's very satisfying when you explain to someone why this statement works badly, and they say, oh, right, okay, oh, I can do, you give them an idea, and they say, I've got 6 or 7 places I'm doing the same thing. It's very gratifying when you can do that. Right? But the sheer excitement that I got from fixing the coffee machine is ridiculous. Yeah, it's a memory which will not go away. Yes.
So I think we can stop here.
Yep. Okay. Well,
I'd like to thank you very much for this exciting talk.
Well, no, my pleasure. I'm having a lovely time here in Moscow, and it's lovely weather outside, and no, I'm delighted to be here. And yes, it's been very pleasurable. Thanks very much, Timo.
Thank you.
Okay.